In the dying light of a frontier dusk, a drifter plunged into a raging river to pull an Apache woman from the current. By sacred law, the moment bound their fates together, whether he wished it or not. From that night forward, Samuel Cutter stood between two worlds, a town that despised him, and a woman whose silence carried more strength than any rifle. When the storm broke, when the mob came with fire and iron, one man's choice between fear and dignity would decide whether love, or death, claimed them both beneath the falling snow. The horse moved slow, its hooves dragging through the red dust of evening. Samuel Cutter let the reins hang loose, his body bent forward, shoulders hunched against the long miles behind him. The town lay ahead in a low valley, where the last light of day sank behind roofs of rough pine and smoke drifted upward like tired prayers. He was a man past 30, though the years had aged him further, lining his face with wear and solitude. Once he had been a husband, a father, a man with a cabin full of laughter and tools sharp from use. Now he rode as though half-ghost, flesh carrying the memory of weight long since gone. On his jaw ran an old scar, faint in daylight but harsher in firelight, a reminder of winters fought and won alone. The people of the town knew his kind. A drifter. A man who had once held claim to soil and family and had let it all slip into the hands of sickness and betrayal. They nodded at him when he came for supplies, but their eyes moved past him as quick as sparrows, unwilling to linger on a man who bore the smell of loss. That night the town gathered near the riverbank, where willows bent in the twilight and children skipped stones across the fading light. The air was restless, spring-chilled, and the river ran faster than it had in months, fed by mountain snowmelt. Samuel had only just tied his horse when the commotion began. A cry rose sharp across the water. Someone shouted, pointing, and Samuel saw her, a woman swept into the torrent, her dark hair a streaming banner, her hands clawing at the foam. The river spun her like driftwood, throwing her against a hidden boulder before wrenching her loose again. The crowd gasped, murmurs breaking into fear. "She's Apache," someone muttered. "Leave her," another spat. "Best let the river keep her." But Samuel did not think. His boots tore loose of the stirrups, and before sense could anchor him, he was running down the bank, stripping his coat with one hand. The water was iron cold when he struck it, a knife that closed around his chest. The current seized him, dragging at his legs, but he pressed forward, teeth gritted, arms cutting the waves with desperate rhythm. She fought the water as best she could, but her strength was bleeding away. Samuel caught her by the arm when a whirlpool tried to spin her under. Her eyes flashed open for a breath, dark, defiant, terrified. Then she went limp against him. The weight of her dragged at him like stone. He kicked hard, lungs aflame, pulling them both toward the bank. Voices roared behind him, some urging, some cursing, but none moving into the water to aid him. When at last his boots struck gravel, he heaved her up and staggered, falling to his knees as the river released them. She coughed, water spilling from her lips, and drew a ragged breath. Samuel's chest burned, every muscle trembling, his clothes heavy and clinging. The crowd pressed forward but not to help. Their eyes were narrowed, voices sharp. "Fool thing to do," a man growled. "Bringing her out, bringing her here." Then the sound of horses came, hooves drumming against wet earth. From the shadowed trees across the river rode the Apache, a small party that had followed the woman's trail. They dismounted quick, surrounding her with shawls and hands, voices rising in their own tongue. An elder stepped forward, his face lined as bark, his gaze steady as the mountains. He looked down at Samuel, who still knelt in the mud, catching his breath. For a long moment, silence hung heavier than the storm clouds above. Then the elder spoke in English, his words like stone laid in the earth. "You pulled her from death. You are bound to her now." The townsfolk shifted uneasily. "What nonsense is this?" the rancher barked. "He owes her nothing. She don't belong here." But the elder did not look at him. His eyes remained on Samuel. "By our law, a life saved ties spirit to spirit. You are her protector now. Her kin, until the spirits say otherwise. The murmurs rose louder, a mix of scorn and suspicion. Samuel felt their weight pressing on his back, the familiar heat of disdain he had known for years. Yet this was heavier, sharper. They saw not a rescue but a dangerous entanglement. The woman stirred, half-conscious, wrapped now in a soaked shawl the elder had given her. Her gaze met Samuel's through strands of wet hair, dark eyes burning faint though her lips were pale. She looked at him as if she knew the cost he had paid in stepping forward, as if she carried the same stone of exile in her chest. Samuel swallowed hard. He could have spoken then, could have refused, could have stood and walked away into the shadows of his own solitude. But something deep inside shifted, subtle as a knife twisting in old wood. The elder placed a hand upon Samuel's shoulder, neither heavy nor light, simply firm. "It is decided." The crowd parted as the Apache gathered the woman and prepared to lead her away. Yet she lingered, swaying on her feet, her eyes still locked on Samuel's as though she waited for him to rise. His body obeyed before his will did. The river roared behind them, cold and merciless, but its claim had been broken. The air was thick with silence, not the easy silence of peace, but the charged silence of storms yet to break. Samuel felt it in his bones, that he could not walk away without dishonor, though every scar in him protested. And so he stood, wet and trembling, a man caught between two worlds, bound by a law not his own, and by a look in her eyes that reached deeper than any river could pull. His ride back toward the edge of town was carried out in silence. Samuel led his horse by the reins while Nayeli walked beside him, shawl clutched close, the night air heavy with dampness from the river. Lanterns still flickered behind them, voices carrying faint on the wind, but neither looked back. The Apache elder had spoken firmly, and the tribe had not argued. Until the matter of sacred law was settled, Nayeli would remain with Samuel Cutter. The townsfolk had looked on with unease, whispering as though the two of them carried a sickness between them. Samuel could feel the weight of their stares burning between his shoulders long after the road bent away from the river. His cabin stood alone on a rise of land beyond the town's last corral. The boards were weathered gray, roof sagging slightly on the west side, the porch steps creaking when his boots struck them. He had built it once with pride, planing the wood by hand, setting each nail with the thought of permanence. Now it looked like a place abandoned, a dwelling that had outlived its owner's will. He pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, dust stirred, and the faint smell of old coffee grounds greeted them. Inside, the hearth was cold, but he set about kindling a fire without a word. Nayeli stood near the door, water-dark braids hanging heavy, her shawl dripping onto the floorboards. She watched him with a stillness that felt older than her years. Flame caught slowly, light flickering across the single room. Shadows shifted over the few possessions Samuel had never thrown away, a pair of boots too small for him, tucked beneath a bench, a rocking chair in the corner, worn smooth by years of use, unmoved since the day laughter ceased to fill it. Nayeli's eyes lingered on the chair. She said nothing, but Samuel felt the silence sharpen, as though she could see into the wound it represented. He looked away quickly, crouching to feed another stick into the fire. From a cedar chest along the wall, the faint outline of lace peeked where the lid had not quite closed. A folded wedding dress, preserved though moth-eaten, still clung to the air with a ghost of lavender. Samuel had not opened that chest in years. He did not need to. Its presence alone was enough to chain him to memory. His wife's laughter came back unbidden, echoing in the crackle of flame. The sound of a child's small feet running across these very boards seemed to thrum in the silence. And then the winter came again, in his mind, snow heavy on the roof, the sickness hollowing out his family one by one, leaving him to dig graves in frozen earth with numb hands. Samuel's jaw tightened as he worked the fire. His loneliness had become a companion, heavy but familiar, a burden he carried without complaint. But with another soul now sitting across from him, the ache grew sharper, like an old wound pressed fresh. Nayeli seated herself by the fire at last, pulling her shawl close as warmth began to seep into the room. Her hands moved with deliberate care, dividing her wet hair into strands and weaving them into long braids. The act was methodical, ritualistic, every fold a defiance against despair, every twist a reminder that she lived. Samuel watched from the corner of his eye. He saw the way her eyes did not fix on the flame but on some distance beyond it, as though she carried her own shadows close. He knew little of her story, but rumors whispered through the border country. Husbands slain in raids, children lost to hunger, families broken by violence. Her silence told him enough. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow. She did not weep. She did not ask. She only breathed slowly, her fingers moving with patience older than grief. Samuel found something unsettling in it. She bore her scars as quietly as he did, but unlike him, she had not surrendered to emptiness. She still tended to small things, the bra ID, the shawl, the fire's warmth, as if survival itself was an act of stubborn devotion. After some time, he brought a basin of water and set it down before her. "For your wounds," he said, voice gravel-worn. Her eyes lifted briefly to meet his. She gave a small nod, accepting without question. He crouched, tearing a strip of cloth from an old shirt, and began to clean the cuts along her arms where the river had thrown her against stone. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred, but careful. He worked without ceremony, without words. Nayeli did not flinch. She let him work, her gaze fixed on the rocking chair in the corner. At length, she spoke, her voice low, accented, carrying weight like a stone dropped into still water. "You keep it for her." Samuel paused, cloth pressed to her skin. For a long breath he did not answer. Then, slowly, he said, "I keep it because I cannot throw it away." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, of memories, of losses unspoken, of two people bound not by choice but by the cruelties of time. When he finished tending her, he sat back, the firelight flickering across his face. His chest felt heavy, as though the old walls had grown closer, pressing inward. Nayeli leaned into the warmth, her shawl pulled tight. Her braids, still damp, gleamed like black rivers in the glow. Neither spoke of the law that held her here. The elder's words hung between them, heavy as stone, but to name it would be to give it flesh. For now, silence served. Samuel leaned his elbows on his knees, staring into the fire until his vision blurred. The past clung to him like dust that refused to be swept away, but for the first time in many winters, another presence shared the room. The storm came sudden, as frontier storms often did, without warning, without mercy. Wind roared down from the high ridges, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. By nightfall, rain hammered the roof of Samuel's cabin like stones thrown by an angry hand. The sky cracked with lightning, each flash throwing the room into stark brilliance before retreating again to gloom. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The fire hissed as raindrops slipped through the chimney stones. Shadows bent and swayed across the walls, crowding the two figures who sat opposite each other. Samuel had never been a man for idle speech, but silence in the storm grew heavy. He cleared his throat, awkward as a boy. "Coffee?" he asked. Nayeli's gaze lifted from the fire. Her dark eyes caught the lightning, reflecting it back with quiet strength. She gave the smallest nod. Samuel poured from the blackened pot, its aroma bitter and grounding, and handed her the tin cup. Her hands, though calloused from work, held the cup with grace. She sipped, slow and deliberate, as though measuring each swallow against the storm's rhythm. Samuel drank too, though the taste was sharp. The storm pressed around them, the walls trembling under its fists, and their nearness inside that small room felt as taut as a bowstring. The storm was not the only thing pressing in. Hooves struck mud outside, faint at first, then clearer. Samuel stiffened. Through the rain, he heard voices, men's voices, rough and angry. He set his cup down, reached for the rifle resting by the door, and rose. Nayeli remained still, though her shawl slid tighter around her shoulders, her eyes narrowing toward the sound. A knock came, hard and insistent. Samuel opened the door, and the wind drove rain against his chest, soaking him in a heartbeat. 4 men stood on the porch, lantern light catching the wet brims of their hats. At their head was Elias Garrison, a rancher whose wealth had bought him sway in town. His jaw was set hard, his eyes sharper still. "Evenin', Cutter," Garrison said, though there was no courtesy in his tone. "We come for the squaw." Samuel's grip on the rifle tightened. "She's under my roof." "And that's the problem," Garrison shot back. "You know as well as I, her kind don't belong here. Word's already spread, some say it ain't safe with her in town. Best turn her loose, let her own people take her." "She ain't yours to demand," Samuel said, voice low but steady. "She's here till her people say different." One of the men spat over the railing. "She's trouble. You'll bring her on us all." Lightning split the sky, white as bone. In that instant, Samuel stood framed in the doorway, rifle across his arms, storm at his back. He looked every bit the scarred drifter they called him, but his eyes held a steel they had long forgotten he carried. "You'll not take her," he said. The men shifted uneasily. The storm lashed harder, thunder rolling so close it rattled the lantern in Garrison's hand. For a moment, no one moved. The rain pounded, the wind howled, and the standoff hung by a single thread. Garrison sneered, though his eyes flickered with doubt. "You'll regret this, Cutter. Mark my words. A man alone can't stand against a whole town." Samuel did not answer. He simply held the rifle steady, his silence louder than any threat. At last, Garrison turned, motioning his men away. Boots splashed in the mud, hoofs clattered, and soon the storm swallowed their retreat. Samuel closed the door slowly, his breath leaving him in a long, heavy sigh. His clothes clung cold and wet against him. His hands trembled faintly, though he forced them still as he leaned the rifle back against the wall. The cabin seemed smaller yet, filled not only with the storm's roar but with the echo of choices made, choices that could not be taken back. He turned, weary, and found Nayeli watching him. She had not moved from her place by the fire, but her shawl had slipped loose, her face open to the firelight. Her expression was unreadable, a mask carved by years of necessity, yet beneath it flickered something steady, something unshaken. Samuel moved to hang his coat by the fire. The cold bit deep, his body shaking though he willed it not to show. He lowered himself onto the bench with a groan, fatigue pressing like a stone on his chest. Then, without a word, Nayeli rose. She crossed the short distance, lifted a blanket from the bedroll, and draped it across his shoulders. Her touch was light, her face calm, but the gesture carried weight. Samuel froze, surprised. He looked up, and for the first time since the river, her gaze met his not as stranger to stranger, not as burden to unwilling host, but as something quieter, stronger, recognition, perhaps. She returned to her place by the fire, leaving him with the blanket's warmth sinking into his skin. He did not speak. Words felt clumsy, unworthy of the moment. Instead, he sat still, letting the warmth creep slowly into his bones, and let the storm rage on around them. Something had shifted, he knew. In refusing the town, he had bound himself tighter to her fate. In her silent act of care, she had placed trust in him, fragile as an ember in the dark. It startled him more than the rancher's threats, more than the storm itself. Samuel Cutter, who had buried love beneath snow and silence, felt a spark stir again. He could not name it, and he dared not hope. But in the storm's fury, he glimpsed it all the same. Trust. The days stretched on, measured not by clocks but by the rhythm of survival, firewood split, meals cooked, the quiet press of winter drawing closer. Samuel and Nayeli moved through the cabin like two shadows that had learned not to collide. Their words were few, but the silence between them shifted, becoming less brittle, more like a fabric woven strong enough to hold weight. One morning Samuel showed her how to grind the coffee beans in the mortar his wife had once used. His voice was rough, almost reluctant, as though teaching her trespass upon memory. Yet Nayeli listened carefully, her hands steady as she turned the pestle, the beans cracking beneath her rhythm. The scent rose rich and bitter, filling the cabin with a comfort Samuel had long avoided. Later that same day, Nayeli wandered into the shed behind the cabin. The place smelled of rust and dust, a graveyard for tools left idle too long. She found a chair shoved against the wall, one leg splintered, another loose. She carried it inside without asking, set it on its side, and fetched Samuel's hammer. The sound of nails biting would echoed in the small room, each strike purposeful. Samuel watched from the doorway, saying nothing. By nightfall the chair stood whole again, steadier than it had been in years. Their shared acts did not erase the distance, but they carved out something new, an uneasy rhythm, fragile but real. Yet the world outside did not soften so easily. One morning, while Samuel split kindling, Nayeli stepped out to fetch water from the barrel near the porch. The town children had crept close, curious eyes bright with the cruelty borrowed from their parents. They began to jeer, voices sharp, stones snatched from the dirt road. The first stone struck the barrel, ringing hollow. Another skipped off the porch rail. Nayeli stood still, her shawl drawn close, her braids hanging heavy. She did not flinch, though her jaw tightened. Samuel heard the scuffle and turned. Fury lit his veins. He dropped the axe and strode forward, voice breaking into a roar he had not used in years. Enough. The children scattered like startled birds, stones clattering useless to the dirt. Their laughter, high and nervous, faded as they fled back toward town. Samuel stood on the porch, fists clenched, chest heaving. The anger in him was not only for the stones, but for every scornful glance, every whisper that had trailed him since the river. He turned and found Nayeli watching him, her face calm though her eyes carried an old sorrow. She said nothing. She did not need to. That night, the fire burned low, its glow throwing long shadows across the walls. Samuel sat on the bench, his hands clasped, words turning heavy on his tongue. Nayeli sat across from him, braids falling over her shoulders like black rivers, her gaze steady on the flames. He drew a breath, ragged. She died in childbirth. My wife. The boy, he lived only a day. The words scraped his throat. They had lain buried for years, but now, under the press of silence, they rose like stones forced from thawing earth. I buried them in snow that winter, he went on, staring into the fire as though it might swallow his confession. When spring came, I buried what was left of myself. My kin, they had no use for a man who carried bitterness heavier than plow or spade. They turned their backs, one by one, until there was no one left. His voice faltered, but the fire kept burning, crackling like an old witness. Nayeli did not speak, did not offer comfort. She simply listened, her face softened by the glow, her presence as steady as the earth beneath them. The weight of his past spilled into the room, yet it did not crush him. For the first time, he fell. Its shift, shared in silence with another who understood loss too deeply to flinch. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Soft flakes tapped against the window, clinging to the glass before melting away. The storm that had raged days before seemed a distant cousin to this quiet descent. Samuel rose, stepped to the window, and watched the flakes blur the dark world beyond. He felt both fear and longing coil inside him. Fear, because something fragile was stirring where only ashes had been. Longing, because the silence no longer felt like a prison but like soil ready for seed. Behind him, Nayeli stirred the fire, her braids swaying with the motion. She glanced toward him briefly, her eyes calm, then returned to the work of tending flame. Samuel realized then that the law which bound them mattered little compared to the bond forming in smaller, quieter ways, through coffee shared, through stones endured, through truth spoken in firelight. It was not love yet, but it was something dangerous, something alive. And as the snow fell soft across the land, Samuel Cutter, scarred and hollowed by loss, dared to let his wounds be seen. The news reached Samuel's cabin with the speed of wildfire. Cattle had been taken from Elias Garrison's spread, 10 head driven off in the night, brands fresh cut from their hides. By morning, men were shouting in the streets of town, voices sharp with anger. And as Samuel had feared, the blame turned swiftly toward the Apache. Who else would it be? Garrison thundered outside the saloon. Savages have been circling for weeks. They watch, they wait, and now they strike. The town, ever eager for an enemy, seized on his words. By afternoon, a mob was gathering, men loading rifles, lanterns swinging in their fists, hatred in their eyes. But Samuel knew the truth. He had seen the riders 2 nights before while checking his trap line, 3 drifters, hard-eyed and lean, driving stolen cattle west. He had chosen silence then, not wanting to entangle himself further. Now his silence burned like a coal in his chest. If he spoke, if he named the true thieves, he would stand against Garrison, a man whose wealth and voice carried weight. To defend Nayeli's people would be to cast himself out of the town entirely. Yet to say nothing would be to let hatred carve another grave. The weight of the choice pressed on him all day, heavy as stone. That night, the cabin became a crucible. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the howl of distant wind across the hills. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, its crackle filling the silence. Rifles rested against the corner, shadows stretched long across the floor. Samuel sat at the table, his hands clasped tight, knuckles white. Nayeli moved quietly about the room, setting a pot to boil, her braids swaying with each step. The air between them was taut, alive with things unsaid. At last, Samuel spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "I can't stay silent." Nayeli paused, turning her gaze toward him. The firelight caught her face, softening the lines of grief, sharpening the lines of strength. "If I let them ride against your people," he said, "I'll be no better than the men who turned their backs on me. But if I speak, if I stand against Garrison, it'll cost me what little ground I still have here." The words trembled in his chest, though his voice held steady. He felt as though he were standing once more in the river, current dragging, the choice between sinking and fighting tearing at him. Nayeli came to sit across from him. Her eyes did not waver. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, carrying the weight of years. "My first husband," she said, "was accused of theft he did not do. They hanged him at dawn. I watched from the edge of the square, my hands bound, my voice stolen by the men who held me. He begged for breath, for mercy, and I could give him nothing." Her fingers brushed the table's edge, slow and absent. "Grief is heavy. But helplessness," she drew a breath, long and sharp, "helplessness burns hotter. It does not leave the bones." The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Samuel looked at her across the table, and in that moment, he saw her fully, not only as the woman he had pulled from the river, not only as the stranger bound to him by law, but as one who bore scars equal to his own. Her sorrow and his were different rivers, yet they flowed from the same storm. "You will not be alone if you speak," Nayeli said. Samuel's chest ached. He had lived so long under the weight of silence, letting the world name him bitter, useless, half dead. Yet here, in the glow of firelight, her words struck something long buried. Dignity. The kind that came not from land or reputation, but from standing upright in truth, no matter the cost. The rifles gleamed in the corner, waiting. Outside, hatred gathered like thunder beyond the hills. But here, at this table, another fire burned, quieter, stronger. Their eyes held across the flickering light. Neither spoke again. The silence itself was enough. Slowly, without ceremony, Samuel reached across the table. Nayeli's hand met his, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. The touch was not soft, not hesitant. It was steady. In that moment, no mob, no rancher, no law, sacred or settler, held sway. Only the fire, only their scars, only the unspoken promise that whatever came, they would face it not as strangers, but as kin forged in survival. Samuel felt his heart steady, the weight in his chest shifting. The man who had once buried himself beneath snow and silence now felt the heat of conviction rising. He had something worth standing for, worth risking for. And Nayeli, who had watched helplessness burn her once, saw in his eyes that she was no longer alone. The fire crackled, their hands remained joined, and the night closed around them. Dawn broke pale and brittle, the sky washed in gray as though the night had drained the color from the world. Frost clung to the fence rails, and smoke rose thin from scattered chimneys. Samuel saddled his horse in silence, the leather creaking beneath his hands. Nayeli stood beside him, shawl drawn close against the cold, her braids dark against the light of morning. They rode together, the snow crunching beneath hooves, the breath of the horses steaming in the chill. The river lay quiet now, its surface crusted with ice at the edges. Samuel's thoughts were as restless as the current beneath, but his face remained still. By the time they reached the town, men were already gathered, rifles gleaming in the pale sun. The mob had grown overnight, anger fed on rumor, until it seemed half the settlement stood bristling at the center square. Garrison was there too, mounted high, his voice cutting the air like a whip. "Today we put an end to the raiding," he declared, raising his rifle. "The law of survival demands it. They strike our herds, we strike back." The crowd murmured its assent, boots stamping the frozen ground. Samuel felt the weight of eyes upon him as he rode forward. He dismounted slowly, the cold biting through his coat, and faced the mob. Nayeli slipped down beside him, her shawl pulled tight, her gaze steady. "I'll speak," Samuel said, his voice low but carrying. Garrison sneered. "You've already chosen your side, Cutter. Best step aside before you're carried off with them." Samuel let the insult pass. His eyes moved across the crowd, catching men he had once shared drink with, men who had once called him friend before grief had driven him into silence. Now they watched him with suspicion, some with contempt. "The cattle weren't taken by the Apache," Samuel said, each word measured, clear. "3 drifters drove them west 2 nights past. I saw them with my own eyes." Jeers broke from the crowd. "Liar. Protectant savages." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. "You call me liar, yet there are witnesses." He lifted a hand, and from the edge of the square, 3 Apache men stepped forward, their faces grave, their posture unflinching. They spoke few words in the settler tongue, but their presence was testimony enough. They had tracked the drifters, found signs no white man could deny. Garrison shifted in his saddle, color rising in his face. "You take their word over your own kin?" Samuel's eyes turned to him, steady as stone. "I take truth over pride. And truth is what you fear most." The crowd wavered. Murmurs rippled like wind across dry grass. Some looked at the Apache with suspicion, but others, wiser, quieter, saw the certainty in their stance, the honesty in their eyes. Samuel continued, voice gaining strength, though it trembled with the cost. "You speak of law, Garrison. But there is no law in spilling blood to cover lies. You speak of survival, but it is not survival you seek, it is vengeance dressed as justice. And vengeance is a fire that burns all who feed it." The words cut through the jeers like steel through cloth. Silence spread, uneasy and heavy. Garrison's mouth worked as though to answer, but no words came. The eyes of the crowd no longer followed him, but Samuel. At last, someone spat in the snow and muttered, "I'll not hang a man's guilt on another's head." One by one, men lowered their rifles. The mob thinned, the heat of its anger cooling in the cold morning air. Garrison cursed low, but when no one followed his lead, he turned his horse and rode off, his shame trailing like dust behind him. Silence remained in the square. No applause rose, no voices praised. Yet the silence was enough. In it, Samuel felt the weight on his chest loosen. For the first time in years, he had spoken with no fear of loss, no fear of the cost. He had stood, and the world had not broken him. He turned to Nayeli. She had not moved, her gaze still calm, her shawl wrapped close. Her eyes met his, and in their depth he saw something shift, not law, not duty, but choice. They left the town without a word. The ride home was quiet, snow beginning to fall, soft and thick, blanketing the scars of the land. The flakes clung to Samuel's coat, to Nayeli's shawl, to the horse's manes. It was as though the world itself wished to cover the wounds of the night, to grant them peace, however fragile. When they reached the cabin, Samuel stabled the horses and carried wood to the hearth. Nayeli stepped inside, her movements sure, unhurried. She crossed to the old rocking chair by the fire, the one that had sat untouched for years, his late wife's shadow lingering there like dust, and laid her shawl across its back. It was a small act, quiet as breath. Yet Samuel felt its weight like thunder. She had chosen to stay, not by law, not by decree, but by will. He stood by the fire, watching the flames curl and shift. His rifle rested against the wall, no longer in his hands. His scars remained, but they no longer burned. Nayeli turned, her face soft in the firelight. For a moment, the silence stretched, rich and full. Samuel felt the years of loneliness settle into something different, something steadier, stronger. He realized then that salvation did not come with noise or victory cries. It came with small choices made in firelight and snow, with hands joined across a table, with shawls laid over old scars. And Nayeli, standing there with the fire warming her face, realized the same, that though sacred law had bound them first, it was choice that had bound them stronger. The snow fell heavy outside, covering the earth, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in years, Samuel Cutter was not alone.